God, God damn it. Fuck, guys. I have a big problem. I overslept again. And today was the day I was supposed to record my lines for the Link's Awakening review. Oh, what am I gonna do? It's now so late that I have to choose between getting myself dressed and showered, or sharing my thoughts on the HD remade version of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for the Switch, as well as my history with the Legend of Zelda franchise. If you followed my content for any length of time, it should come as absolutely no surprise that I'm a huge fan of the Legend of Zelda series. In fact, it's my favorite Nintendo franchise of all time. I've been playing these games for years, starting with Twilight Princess, and Link's Awakening is now the third Zelda game I've streamed, making a Zelda playthrough sort of an annual tradition on my channel, if you don't know what a year or an annual tradition are. These games hold a very special place in my heart, and to date there's very few of them left that I haven't played. In particular, I first played Link's Awakening about 5 years ago, I think, and by the end of it I was blown away by the sheer quality that they could fit into a Game Boy Zelda game. The story, gameplay, and soundtrack all oozed that exceptional Zelda quality we've come to expect, so I had really high hopes for this remake. This is Animal Crossing, just watch. That would be... Oh my god! It's Link's Awakening! I fucking love this game! But it was already hard enough to make a game of this caliber work on a Game Boy cartridge, and a Switch cartridge is like an eighth of that size. Now, I'm not studying computer science at university or anything, so I know for an absolute fact that bigger cartridges mean a bigger game, so how's this remake going to work? Simply put, exceptionally. The Switch remake of Link's Awakening took a game I adore and stripped virtually all criticisms I had of the original away. Let's start with one of the most obvious changes, the controls. Now, as you can see, this is a Game Boy Color. On very close examination of this system, we can determine that there's only 2 face buttons on this thing. In a game like The Legend of Zelda with lots of different items, you can see how this might be a problem, especially if the sword has to be considered an item as well. Speaking of the sword, take a peek at Link's original sprites. Did you notice anything weird about this? In the original, Link must not have gotten enough bits into his brain because he completely forgot about the existence of the 4th quadrant, leaving a complete blind spot in his attack pattern. That issue simply doesn't exist in the remake. The Joy-Cons have way more buttons, leaving you a dedicated sword, shield, and Pegasus boot button, meaning your 2 item slots get to actually be item slots. Movement feels like the original, but a lot more fluid since Link knows how to face diagonally now, and all of this comes together in a beautiful way to make all forms of combat and exploration far less tedious, so it's allowed to be fun. Provided you actually know how to press your buttons. That should help me out. I can jump across here. I can jump across here. I also really appreciate that I didn't have to read someone's thesis paper on obstacles every time I bumped into a rock this time around, since Link's Awakening HD is chock full of quality of life improvements. Now, let's talk about this HD part. I think Link's Awakening is a beautiful game, and although my initial reaction to the art style was pretty neutral, trending towards negative even, I now think that the cutesy graphics were a great decision. I've been talking about the original game a lot in this review, and that's mostly because the remake's stylistic and gameplay decisions really do make strides to remind you that this is a modernized take on a Game Boy game. Zelda's never exactly looked like this before, but you can't tell me this isn't exactly how the young kids who played this game on release must have visualized the sprites. Now, I'm not one who's really critical over graphics. If a game doesn't look as good as it could on its hardware, I'm not really bothered. But graphical elements done well do stand out to me, and the blurring around the screen's edges in this game definitely fits that bill. I can't even explain what's so nice about them. Maybe it's that it calls back to the original's rigid screens without sacrificing modern 2D Zelda's smooth scrolling, or maybe it's that the blurring makes the center of the screen where all the action is really pop. I'm not sure, but I am sure that it's pretty, and I'm also sure that I just spent more time talking about a blur effect than I did about the controls. Am I qualified to do this professionally yet? One thing that the original did incredibly well that was preserved in this remake was the overworld and how dense it is. Koholint Island is pretty small, but you can't take 2 steps without tripping over some buried treasure. Some of the buried treasure is also buried really deep, so you could trip in the exact same spot multiple times, except it's a terrible analogy because this kind of discovery is genuinely exciting. I went for about 99% completion this time around. I didn't do absolutely everything that you'd need in a 100% run because the chamber stones didn't interest me, but I did go for every secret seashell and piece of heart. Although some of these goodies took forever to find, it was never frustrating to comb the island, as you're given quite a lot of tools to navigate this relatively small space very quickly. The dungeon designs in this game are pretty solid, with a nice difficulty curve. The first few dungeons go by very quickly, and frankly, they aren't the most interesting, but as you go on, the theming of the dungeons, the layouts, and the puzzles are all augmented in quality, size, or difficulty. I think it's around level 4 or 5 when the quality noticeably jumps up, and it's at level 6 where things kick into overdrive. And at the backbone of that quality, there's the game's soundtrack and narrative. Do you ever just sit for a moment and consider the choices you've made that led you to this point in life? I certainly do, because I'm about to put a spoiler warning on a discussion of this game's soundtrack. Trust me, it makes sense, it just sounds really silly. So if you don't want the story of Koholint Island spoiled for you, skip to the timestamp below. Otherwise, I'm going to unleash my inner music nerd on you very shortly. Okay, let's get into it. Before I start the analysis, let's take a moment to listen to the base cave theme, which is one of the first songs you'll hear in the game. This song will be pretty important later. Link's Awakening's soundtrack was a very musically sophisticated soundtrack, even back in the Game Boy days, and it's entirely through its usage of various motifs throughout the soundtrack. The level 1 to 4 dungeon themes all use a variation on the standard cave theme, which I interpret as representative of the early game from both a narrative and a gameplay point. The player is just getting used to the dungeons available in this game, which at this point are not that difficult, so the game ties them all together with a previously introduced musical idea of exciting subterranean exploration. Much like the dungeons themselves, the music is simple and fun, but not exceptionally complex. But then the Catfishes Mall comes around, once you've collected half of the instruments of the sirens, and this theme is oppressive and ominous, devoid of the familiar cave melody. The song seemingly comes out of left field, but it's a prelude to the most important moment of the game. After leaving this dungeon, you're meant to go to the Southern Shrine, where you discover that Koholint Island is nothing but a dream. By waking the Windfish and securing his freedom from the island, Link must destroy everything he's come to hold dear on his adventure. It introduces this layer of tragedy to the game's narrative, but with this being originally a Game Boy game, that's a bit hard to convey with text alone. Where Link's Awakening's narrative succeeds is in its union with the dungeons and soundtrack. My absolute favorite moment in the game is when you reach the Face Shrine and encounter not only a significant difficulty spike, but also the most hauntingly beautiful song in the entire game. The dungeon bosses become desperate to stop you. They'll all cease to be should you succeed. The difficulty of the dungeon really pushes that this journey isn't nearly as simple as you expected it to be. As the backdrop to all of this, the Face Shrine's theme is representative of Link's inner turmoil, with shifting dynamics between barely audible to deafeningly loud, conveying that those thoughts just won't go away, even when Link's concentrating on just pressing onwards. The later dungeon themes are equally distinct and meaningful, and I think it's remarkable how so much of this game's narrative can be conveyed through subtext alone. In that regard, I think Link's Awakening stands tall above the rest of the franchise. In terms of the instrumental structure of the music, I couldn't be happier. The soundtrack is fully orchestrated but integrates the original chiptune sounds, creating an aural texture that really resonates with me as a fan of genre fusion, classical instrumentation, and the original game. I haven't been writing jokes in this segment because the soundtrack as a whole is just so meaningful to me. I've always wanted to go in depth into a soundtrack in one of these videos, and Link's Awakening just provided the perfect opportunity to me. I have no shame in admitting that the Face Shrine theme nearly brought me to tears. Let's talk about some side content, because if you want all of the seashells and heart pieces, you're gonna have to do it. I really liked the fishing minigame. It didn't take too long to get all of its rewards, and was pretty fun while I was doing it, so that makes it great side content to me. The raft game was similar, and since it took advantage of your overworld skills, it became my go-to method for making money. The trendy game was designed by Satan. It is the purest form of evil to ever curse this land. The physics actually just don't work sometimes, and this results in the trendy game being a form of torture. I weep for the poor souls of Mabe Village who only have this to do on a Saturday night. Right there. Right there. Claw Master. Then we go. Right into the middle. Oh no. Oh. I hate seashells. I hate seashells. Then we have the introduction of Dampe the Gravekeeper, new to the remake. Dampe wants to invite you over to his shack to play with his Lego sets, which is a really nice gesture and could be a lot of fun, but he's not exactly got the best collection. This is the Zelda series' first dungeon creator, which has preset challenges for you to complete to earn heart pieces and seashells. This sounds incredible in theory, but the execution leaves something to be desired. You only get to use preset tiles from other dungeons you've completed, which saps a lot of the creativity. It also takes a really long time to complete all of the challenges, and there's only one dungeon theme for every chamber dungeon you create. Overall, it almost feels to me like this shouldn't have been in this game. Like, it really did feel out of place. But if this is Nintendo's trial to see if people actually want a Zelda Maker, then hopefully we get something more exciting in the future. And that just about sums up my soundtrack analysis, review of Link's Awakening for the Switch. The original was already a fantastic game, and the remake fixed virtually every issue I had with it. The complaints I had about the game were mostly in the domain of optional side content, and were mostly nitpicks to begin with. Link's Awakening is an incredible entry in one of my favorite franchises of all time, with a soundtrack so meaningful to me that I can't help but love my experience with the game. So this game gets my full recommendation, but I can't say for sure if a game of this length is worth the full $80 price tag. Overall, though, my adventure through Koholint Island was a fantastic time, and I'm very glad that you all shared this adventure with me. If you've played the game for yourself and disagreed with anything I said, I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments below. And if this is the first you've seen of my content, you can find me at twitch.tv/turkeysub23. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really am running late. I have to get myself lost in the hills later, so I really must be going.